Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Chris Chibwana and I'm the head of Africa at ID Insight, a data analytics research and advisor organization that helps development leaders use data and evidence to strengthen their social impact. We're honored to be hosting this webinar today on behalf of Clear Anglophone Africa, which draws on insights from chapter 11 of the book that was co-edited by Pabari and Ian Goldman. The title of the book is Using Evidence in Policy and Practice, Lessons from Africa. Today we're going to discuss themes from chapter 11 of the book, whose co-authors are with us today, and you will hear from some of them. This particular chapter discusses lessons from a case in Ghana where civil society facilitated the use of evidence to inform sanitation policy and also improve service delivery. We've got an exciting lineup of speakers that I'm pleased to introduce to you at this time. Pabari is currently a visiting research fellow with Clear Anglophone Africa and the managing partner of Atari Advisor. Professor Ian Goldman is no stranger. He joined Clear Anglophone Africa in 2018. And among his many hats, he's also an adjunct professor at the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance at the University of Cape Town. We're also joined by Dede Bedu-Addo, who is the coordinator of the Ghana Monitoring and Evaluation Forum, and also an independent consultant on gender and social development. You also get a chance to hear from Mohammed Awal, who is a senior research analyst and a team leader for social accountability and SDG programming at the Ghana Center for Democratic Development at CDD-Ghana. We'll also be joined by Ms. Henrietta Osei-Tutu, who is a senior public health engineer in the Ministry of Sanitation and Water Resources in Ghana. And at the time of drafting the book, she was the liquid waste program manager at the ministry. And finally, we're also privileged to have in the audience, Leila Smith, who was the lead author on this chapter. That's the focus of this webinar. Leila is the senior advisor on learning and evaluation at Clear Anglophone Africa. Now, here's how the webinar will be structured. We'll first hear from Pabari, who will present an overview of the analytical framework that guides this work. And then we'll hear briefly from Ms. Osei-Tutu from the Ministry of Sanitation and Water Resources, after which Dede and Awal will come in to present the case study, the particular case study that's the focus of chapter 11 of the book. After that, we'll have a moderated question and answer session, and I'll invite you to submit your questions as presenters are making their contributions using the chat function or either using the Q&A, and we'll make sure that those questions are captured and responded to. After that, we'll close. I'm now going to turn it over to Mine to share the analytical framework for this work. Mine, please.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris. Okay, just a couple of minutes on the background and then the analytical framework. So this case study comes from a research project specifically looking at the use of evidence in policy and practice in Africa. We came at the research from the perspective of policymakers, so a demand perspective rather than a supply perspective where the focus tends to be. The research was conducted by an African research team with researchers from each of the countries, but also importantly, a policymaker as a co-author. So we really ensured that we had the guidance and the insights of the policymakers for each case. The research and the case studies focus, they explore the use of different types of evidence, ranging from evaluations, rapid synthesis through to citizen engagement, and really looking at what enabled or hindered the use of evidence, as you'll see from this case study. This has been published in a book and the link is up there, and we'll also share the link with everyone through the chat. These are the chapters here and sort of gives you a flavor of the range of different types of cases we had, the different types of sources of evaluation from a variety of different contexts. All of the case studies were guided by a common analytical framework, and this really helped us to think in a cohesive and in a similar manner. Not so much to tell us how evidence use should or should not take place, but really to come at it in terms of what sort of things do you look for in order to better help you understand an evidence journey and what influences evidence use. Sorry, I just want to also point out that the framework was developed building on two existing frameworks. So the Science of Using Science by Langer and al., and the Context Matters framework. And we built on that through the experiences and the findings from the case study. This is the framework. I'll just take a few minutes to walk you through the different pieces. So right at the onset is the recognition that evidence use is influenced. It doesn't take place in a vacuum. It is influenced by a context and a number of different contextual factors. This is both in the external context as well as the internal. So really by things such as the political and social, broader political and social environment, or relationships between the different state, non-state, and within even state agents. In our case, as I already said, our starting point was the demand for evidence and where that came from and what that looked like. We didn't spend a lot of time on evidence generation, but obviously recognizing in its place in the framework, the importance of that and the importance of ensuring that the evidence is of a robust quality. Where we spent more time and energy is looking at what we thought about as use interventions, which were employed to enable evidence use. So for example, the deliberate use of, or not, of champions or awareness raising initiatives, or building capacity of the different actors involved in the evidence journey to understand and engage with the evidence. And the changes that these triggered. So having a capacity building or using capacity building initiatives in order to strengthen awareness, as well as allow for a platform of interaction and trust building. And we saw this, we saw the importance of these changes across all of the different cases, and you'll see them illustrated very well in this particular case. We then looked at, and we looked for the changes in terms of individual, organizational systems changes that happened as a result of the evidence journey, in terms of strengthening motivation to use evidence, or capabilities, or even opportunities, and the capability to recognize the opportunity to use evidence. And all of these were critical in whether or not evidence was used and how it was used. We looked at different types of evidence use, from instrumental, sort of the more tangible, concrete uses, or using of evidence to change policy and practice. A conceptual use of evidence where it was much more around strengthening the understanding of the actors involved of a particular issue, as well as process use of the benefits that arose as a result of having participated in the evidence journey. And when I speak about evidence journey, I'm talking about this middle bit here. And ultimately, in theory, the use of evidence should then lead to a development impact. And there's quite a big leap between the actual use of evidence to the development impact. And this wasn't something we were able to look at, but would certainly be something that would be interesting to look at. And with that, I will hand over to Dede to kick us off with the case study. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks, Mine. Thanks, Mine. But just before I come in, I don't know if Henrietta has been able to log in. She was trying to get on board, but having some challenges. So
yeah,
if she is here,
she does seem to be here, yeah.
Oh, great. So let me give her the opportunity to say a few words. Okay, Hetty.
Henrietta, you need to unmute yourself. On the bottom left of the Zoom screen, you'll see a thing that says mute. You need to go unmute.
Okay, while we wait for Hetty to sort things out, let me just go ahead and give a quick overview of the case. I think it's important to mention that we try to merge two things in this chapter. One is a broad look at the sanitation sector and how evidence has been used within the wider context or as a sector. And then we decided to zero in on the CDD case because we found it an interesting one where you get a CSO using government data or government evidence to make a case for government to be more proactive and to respond to citizens' demands and needs. So I will quickly do the overview and then I'll give Awal the case to tell us a bit more about the CDD example. So Mina, if you can go to the next slide. Okay, so I thought I'd begin by mentioning that CSOs play a critical role when it comes to evaluation, especially in contexts like ours. Now, we find out that apart from the fact that they employ people who work on evaluations, in fact, here you'd find out that a lot of CSOs, if not most of them, have quite robust M&E systems because it feeds into their fundraising mechanisms and so on. You also find out that CSOs are critical within the space of using evidence for advocacy. And in the sanitation sector especially, this has been quite strong because of the history of the sanitation sector itself. However, in spite of all their contributions to evidence, especially for evaluation and monitoring, CSO's voice is not very loud when it comes to this. And so when we found this example or this case came up, we thought we would zero in a little bit on the sanitation sector and see how it's panned out in that area. So what enabled some of this? The environment for discussion and open collaboration in Ghana, especially between government and civil society, is quite strong in Ghana. What we have found is there are a lot of things that in other places you think government would do, but in Ghana you'd find civil society has stepped in to support, especially with services, social services and so on. And so in the sanitation sector especially, you find out that effective waste management and improved sanitation was really way back. We did not seem to be doing very well. In fact, in 2015, UNICEF reports put us at the second worst country in the world. And obviously, that led to much outcry, and the president responded by creating the Ministry of Sanitation and Water Resources, and then also putting in a lot more resources for work on sanitation. It also meant that civil society needed to fill some of these gaps and also work more collaboratively with governments. So you'll find out that international pressure based on evidence and also a lot of campaigns by CSOs, both large international NGOs like WaterAid, and then coalitions like CONIWAS, which is the coalition of NGOs in water and sanitation, pushed for increased presidential commitments. Next slide, please. So what are some of the use of evidence that we found in this sector? We found out that actually there was quite a bit of instrumental use. If you look at the development of national policies and plans, right from, there's an old sanitation policy, which was strongly influenced by INGOs like WaterAid and so on. You find out that UNICEF, the World Bank, and other development partners have played a critical role in pushing for national policies. When you move to the district level, you find out that planning is also supported a lot by CSOs working in this sector and ensuring that real evidence from the grassroots is used in developing some of these plans. From a conceptual point of view, you find out that there's been a lot of advocacy around service delivery, actually using evidence on the ground to show that where there are differences, where national resources have not reached people adequately. And consequently, there's quite a bit of symbolic use around citizens and citizens groups or CSOs using evidence to strengthen their petitions for improved services. Yes, Mina. Okay, so what are some of the mechanisms? So workshops, there have been a lot of workshops, especially for collaboration and looking at indicators, example for monitoring and evaluation of the sector. And this has led to better relationships and ownership of the process, and also even the evidence that comes out of this. I'm not going to go through all these points because of the time, but let me just mention a few, and then when Awal speaks, he will go into more detail. We have found active advocacy, as I mentioned earlier, and this has led to increased dialogue. Because for most of these meetings, say for instance, when you take CONIWAS, that's the coalition, they do have an annual water conference where you have both government and civil society meeting to look at critical areas of water and sanitation. And they do this based on real evidence as members would present it and share at these different meetings. Now, if you look at the DLT, or I'm Aware as the I'm Aware project, as Awal will speak to in a moment, they even go further to push for a ranking system amongst districts so that there's some amount of competition around district performance in providing these services. And they use the real evidence that the districts themselves provide to make a case for improving their performance in this area. Now, when we spoke to the National Development Planning Commission, their role is to pull together national reports on development at all levels. They did mention that before they would give authorization for the national budget for different districts and even the sectors, they would also look at the reports that are presented to them, as much as possible, relying on real evidence and data that has come through. So clearly this has led to some amount of institutionalization and understanding of evidence and its use amongst the different partners. Of course, along the way, we've also built a lot of relationships, increasing the trust around the evidence used, even the generation of the evidence itself, and then how it's used, and then people's abilities have also been built in the process. I think I'm going to my last slide also. Okay, yes. So facilitators and barriers, what are some of the things that assisted? A couple of them are around a lot of CSO consultations and active participation. So increasingly, as we built confidence and the relationships improved between the different partners, what we found is there's increased consultation. In many cases, the ministry will tell you they will invite CSOs to be part of their processes. Of course, this is not perfect, but it still is a lot better than it used to be. A barrier related to this is interagency coordination. You may be able to speak to the Ministry of Sanitation, but what about the overlap with education or with health? If the agencies themselves aren't speaking to each other, then there are issues. So we do find out that there are still some hiccups around those. Another one is established mechanisms to enable flow of information involve CSOs in decision-making processes. So networks like CONIWAS, the Water Conference, as I mentioned earlier, promote a lot more of sharing and including CSOs in decision-making, even at the governmental level. And this is even better seen at the district level, where they play a better role in the district assemblies. One barrier linked to this is that knowledge that evidence is not always used for decision-making is a disincentive. So where people have found out that the knowledge they put out there, the evidence they put out there is not always used, actually does become quite frustrating, especially for CSOs when you're knocking on doors and you don't always get heard. Issues around incentives and even budgetary resources, my critical one, and I guess it's so in most places. The result is that timeliness of data generation can be a challenge. So you're getting data that is old and you still need to use it for decision making. A key one is the last one down there about the use of evidence champions and mentors. We found out that where you have people who champion this cause, in our case, not the key thing, but definitely very instrumental was the president's own comment and commitment to ensuring that we do better on sanitation. And this is something that I think is a critical facilitator. Okay, I think the last slide is on lessons, Mine. I can take that. Okay, great. So what are some of the lessons we have picked? I think you jumped my lessons. Okay, great. So what are some of the lessons we have picked?
Sorry, Dede, it just keeps jumping. I don't know. I'll try one more time.
All right, great.
No, it won't.
It won't. Okay, so let me speak from my screen and you can put it up when you get it. Okay, so some of the lessons that have come up is the need to strengthen and harmonize the data ecosystem and government's infrastructure. So we need to find ways of aligning the data, the way we collect, use data and evidence, and the governance structure that we have. There are still issues around getting timely, reliable data. And when Awal speaks, he'll tell you a bit more about that. One of the things we also recognize is that community and individual ownership of the evidence process is key. Once people feel that they are part of the process, it's important to them. You find out that they are more willing to support the process and they do help. Clearly, an inclusive culture is paramount. And this is something we found, especially when it comes to evidence. And people need to feel like they're part of the process, and then they can trust you and they can trust the process. Last point that I think is very critical here is the role of VOPs. We are what you call a VOP, that's a voluntary organization of professional evaluators. Now, we found out that when we were asked to look at this case, we could have looked at any other case, but we thought this was a good one because it would help us to bring two key players in the country together to look at evidence. Government on the one hand and CSOs. Very often they sit at opposite sides of the table and cannot really agree on the data or the evidence that needs to be used. We thought this was a good way of looking at how it has worked. Of course, come up with some of the challenges as well so we can learn from them. And as a VOP, we think that this is something we could do as our contribution to evidence use in the country. I believe that in other places as well, VOPs can play a good brokerage role, and also linkages, building some of the relationships that sustain evidence use. Thank you. I'm going to let Awal take over from here and talk about the projects that we looked at in case.
Yes, thank you very much, Dede, for the wonderful discussion. I think that some of the lessons you quite listed really are the things that informed our own intervention relative to the case study that we have. So in 2011, we started off a social accountability initiative we call I Am Aware, which essentially focuses on trying to collect government-produced data, making that in an easily accessible format for citizens to be able to engage with the state. That kind of evidence we find to be very useful, particularly for citizens in their dialogue with government actors, particularly at the local level, in terms of some of the things that are important for them. I think from that pilot phase, we had seen that there is the need for a more scale-up policy intervention initiative. And so we worked with UNICEF Ghana to then start off the Ghana District League Table, which then focuses on what kinds of evidence can we generate that will give us policy indicators that would help both for advocacy, but also for planning and use at the local level. The next slide. Yes, so we started off, and our objective really is to produce a data, to produce an evidence or an information that will support government, but also citizens generally to be aware of the state of development across the country, to be able to track progress, and also through dialogue, through peer pressure, to be able to improve welfare overall for citizens, particularly those who are living in many of our districts in Ghana. So how did we enable the evidence that we produced to be used? Next slide. So essentially, because we were focusing on trying to influence policy with the evidence that we are generating, we had to make sure that the information that we produce is policy relevant, that it connects with the evidence, with the policy challenges that Ghana faces. And this we did by essentially looking at government data and using that data to be able to synthesize that information and then try to see what kinds of information or evidence it presents to us and what that evidence can be used for. One other thing that we did also is try to make sure that this evidence connect with both policy actors and bureaucrats. That these are people who would have to essentially make the decision in the end. To what extent that the evidence or the information that we are producing is relevant to them, appeals to them, so that they will be able to use that. The other thing that we did in making the evidence more salient is also in the manner in which we communicated it. And as Dede said, one of the things we did was to try and put it in a format that allows you to be able to see across the geographical spaces how we are doing in terms of these sectors that we are trying to monitor, which sanitation was one of the big sectors that we focused on. We also made the information available, it's easily accessible for citizens, infographics, user-friendly format that policy actors, academics, anybody else who wants to use the evidence will be able to use the evidence. So we did, beyond making the evidence more salient, the other thing we did was to try and create awareness around that. And so every year, when we produce the scorecard, we try to publish it at the national level through a national launch forum. We try to also go down to the regional level to share the findings from our report to ensure that at least there is some kind of awareness about this evidence and the use that the evidence can be put into both for policy actors, but also most importantly for citizens. We try to foster dialogue through roundtable discussions, citizen government interface, where we create opportunity for citizens to be able to engage. We try to tease out from the report very small information briefs that are easily accessible for policy actors so that they can inform some decisions that they want to make. Can you go to the next slide? Yes, the other thing that we did to enable the use of the evidence was to strengthen capacity. We realized that, yes, you may produce this evidence, but there may be situations where capacity is lacking in terms of how the evidence can be brought into policy space. And so particularly for citizens, we train them about how the methodologies around this evidence, but also for policymakers in terms of the processes that we used to arrive at the findings that we had, but also more broadly, how they can use the evidence that we have in decision-making processes, where the entry points are, particularly where things that we emphasize on at our training. Then, because we're also interested in trying to institutionalize how this evidence is used, we try to engage at multiple levels with key actors in the evidence in the policy space. And so we engage members of parliament, specialized subcommittees that works on local government to strengthen their awareness, to strengthen their capacity to demand some kind of accountability and responsiveness. We also identified and listed champions. And one clear card for us was the former deputy local government minister who essentially became a champion for us, went out there in the field with us and then drummed home the need for this evidence we brought into the policy-making practice. We also mobilize citizens to be able to do advocacy at the local level to ensure that the evidence is actually being used. So these were some of the activities and interventions that we undertook to ensure that there's some process to be able to institutionalize how this evidence is used. In spite of all of these processes, we certainly faced a number of challenges relative to both producing the evidence, but also in fostering how it is used. And particularly, as Dede mentioned, one of the key challenges for us is the weakness in the data ecosystem. And that anybody who is trying to use government data will be confronted with such a challenge. There is insufficient resources allocated for evidence generation in our many government departments and agencies. But also, there is also this problem about lack of quality assurance framework. And so you find different standards in government department in terms of how the data is collected, how it is processed. And so you faced a lot of challenges in terms of how do you bring all of this evidence to be able to build a performance scorecard that allows you to see over many sectors the kinds of improvement or progress that we've made over time. The other challenge that we faced had to do with the performance management system that we had. We were unable to get the evidence into some kind of a reward system that will incentivize many policy actors to begin to look at this as an important ingredient for decision making. Many of the policymakers we engage with say, look, we would like to do it, but what is in it for me? And that is one of the key challenges that we faced. The other one is the resource allocation process in Ghana, the intergovernmental fiscal transfer rules, particularly between the center and the local government, And so decisions are essentially made at the center, resources are located at the center. And so it doesn't allow innovation at the local level in terms of how this evidence can be applied. Applying this evidence would mean that you have to have some resources to be able to use, to be able to apply the evidence into practice. But in the absence of those resources, or in the absence of the allocative decision-making, how this evidence plays out, it becomes very difficult for local actors to be able to apply this evidence that we had. The other weakness we face really is also around capabilities. Even though we've tried to do capacity building for them, there still remain a swath of government policy actors, particularly at the local level, who still continue to find it difficult to bring this evidence into policy space. And so the question about the kinds of capacity building trainings that are done for government policy actors at the local level is something that we had talked about, and encourage the Office of the Local Government Service to try and focus a lot of their capacity building training on how evidence, particularly generated outside of the state machinery, can be brought into the policy-making process. Next slide. In spite of these challenges that I mentioned, I think that we had achieved a number of successes in terms of the use of our evidence, particularly the accessibility that we create, and also the capacities that we build sort of brought pressure on citizen groups. We also have seen some level of use by civil society development partners of this evidence for development programming to inform a lot of their intervention. The ranking of district brought a lot of competition. Low-ranked districts were flagged and they felt pressured, and they acted on a number of interventions to try and address some of the gaps that we see in development across many of our districts. Next slide. Next slide. So what were some of the lessons? So one of the lessons that has come up for us is in the fact that partnerships is important, both formal and informal. And formally, you could sign MOUs that we sign with many governments to be able to then have access to this data. It is also not, there is also a case to be made that it is not enough to just create this evidence and curate it, but you have to adopt an activist intervention to ensure that this evidence is brought into policy. Timing is important. I think that if you do it out of government policy cycles, business cycles, you are bound to find difficulty in how this evidence can be brought into policy. And that we think that you need to understand the incentive structures in government. What is the need for policymakers, for bureaucrats? You have to align your evidence to their incentives. If not, it will become very difficult for you to get it being used in practice. And fostering evidence use requires a lot of time, resources, and investments, and that you should be prepared to go the long haul. It's not a one-off intervention, a one-off relationship. It has to be a long-term relationship that can facilitate that kind of use. Thank you so very much.
Great, thank you very much, Awal. Dede, have we been able to get?
Henrietta,
yes.
I'm trying to, I spoke to her just about 2 minutes ago, trying to get her again. Meanwhile, we're trying to also see if she can unmute her phone. So just give me a second. I hope she picks this up.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. I'm not getting through to her. Can we just go ahead? She will speak when we are able to get her.
Absolutely. Thank you so very much, Mine, Dede, Awal. Thanks for those presentations, very informative. I encourage participants to submit questions through the Q&A or through the chat. And I'll just, put a plug on future webinars that have been organized. There's one on in November that will focus on chapter 6 of the same book. And then for our Francophone colleagues, there's another one in December that will speak to chapter 9. But while people are thinking of questions, I can probably start. My question, I would love to hear from Dede and Awal. Really, I think this is a somewhat different approach to evidence generation and sort of the focus of evidence generation, because traditionally we've focused on empowering the center, like empowering governments and empowering the suppliers of services, and not so much the citizens that are supposed to demand improved quality for services in countries. Why was it important for you to get citizens and not their elected representatives, so not members of parliament, citizens themselves? Why was it important for you to go directly to citizens with the evidence around the quality of sanitation services in their own communities?
Awal, please start.
Yes, I may take that up. I think so. It's both for us. Whilst in terms of our own conceptualization, we focus as a social accountability initiative on citizens, we certainly have engaged their representative as well. But it goes back to the broader context issue about the nature of our democracy and how competitive our democracy has become, and that citizens seems to play quite a very important role in their choices at elections, and elections matter. And so policy actors or government actors will certainly listen to citizens' voice, knowing very well that within, if you don't listen, if you are not responsive, they would vote against you. And so that would sort of incentivize you to use that. And we've heard stories where parliamentarians come out and said, we've lost elections simply because of DLT. You've released the DLT and citizens are angry. We've had people, a policy maker from a village come to our office and say, I'll take you to court because you've created an index that allows citizens to come to me and to attack me. And so we thought that the citizens' pressure part of it and the quality of the nature of our democracy can certainly be an intervening factor to be able to incentivize evidence use in the policymaking process.
Exactly. I think our democracy is moving to a stage where now we are getting ready for elections in December. You should hear on airwaves every day there's a new community asking for better roads, for water, for this. And I think civil society is tired of being the one that says they say so. Now we want the citizen to speak for themselves, and we want to use government's own data. Now you generated this data. This is what you said is going on, and we agree with you. But what does it mean for the citizenry? So let's have a debate around it. And I think it's reduced some of the friction and the confusion around who says what. Because previously, if you raised any data, especially as a CSO, government will tell you, no, we didn't collect that data. What standard is it? We have issues with, your coverage, all that. But now if it's government's own data, then those issues are taken care of.
Great, thank you so much. We have a question from Matodzi, and it's to both of you, Awal and Dede. Your presentation is spot on. Could you also speak more on what others could do? So beyond your own experience, what could others do to encourage citizens to engage with data?
Come again. You also speak on more what others
do. Based on your experience, what would you recommend others do to encourage citizens to engage with data and evidence?
I think that capacity building is certainly important. Citizens need to understand particularly how government system works. And once they get that information, they get that easier for them to be able to engage. But in the absence of that understanding, you would see a lot of them not being able to engage. So capacity building training about how government system works, what the entry points are, can be an incentive for many citizens to be able to participate. And accessibility to the information. Really, a lot of citizens will tell you that, I don't know how government works, I don't have this information. If you look at Afrobarometer data over time, citizens are telling you government is complex. We don't even understand how government works. Certainly that kind of information about how government works can be an incentive to incentivize them to be able to engage with evidence, but also to engage with the policy actors as well.
Yes, I'm glad he finished on that note, because I was going to say access, ensuring that citizens actually have access to this. And I'm aware is internet enabled, so people can log in. As I always tell our young people here, instead of all the WhatsApp gossip, spend a little time finding out about more critical issues that affect you and your community. And so this is an easy one. We just log in and it's there. Also that we encourage more meetings and encourage more CSOs to have access to this kind of data. because a lot of us in the CSO world who write proposals and so on, look for data and evidence. We need to back it to make a case. So let's encourage them to go back to some of this data that is relevant, that is reliable, that can be trusted. And I think also as professionals in the M&E sector, we also need to encourage people to look more at some of this evidence. You know, it's great when we have an emotional story that moves everybody in the field, but what's the data backing that? Why is it relevant? Why is it key? And that's why I said, you know, VOPs and professionals in the field need to sell some of these ideas so that people understand and buy into it.
Thank you very much. Thank you both. We have a few other questions. I'll pick them one by one. Okay. One question, and maybe it's not just to the two of you, I'd love to also hear from Leila, one of the other co-authors. What are some reasons that deter policymakers from using evidence in their decision-making processes?
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so I think one of the challenges that we had in this piece of work was the fact that a lot of the engagement with citizens and the district league table was very much at the district assembly level, which is different in different parts of the region. And when one is thinking about how to influence national decision making in terms of taking the sanitation agenda forward, part of the value of the district league table was that it was actually the only national source of data on sanitation. And so we had a follow-on project called Twende Mbele, which was precisely trying to look at how to create a stronger platform with civil society and the state in terms of how we use M&E evidence to improve policymaking. And a lot of the national civil society players that we were working with recognize the value of the DLT as something that moved beyond their respective projects that were funded by donors that were relevant for a particular region, but couldn't speak nationally to where the gaps are. So the work that Mohammed and Dede and I did on this project really helped identify the problem, which we then followed through to say, look, there's a real challenge around administrative data, and we have to ensure more reliable administrative data as a tool for the state to be able to monitor the performance of district assemblies in a more rigorous manner. So this particular evidence journey was fantastic for allowing us to understand what the problems were and how to ensure greater reliability and quality of data at the district level by virtue of the I Am Aware interface, where citizens were constantly saying, but look, the stuff that's coming out of the district league table has problems, it's not accurate. This is what we're really experiencing. So there was a kind of ground truthing with citizens, which helped improve the quality of what got fed into the district league table. But then when that national perspective was itself incredibly valuable for the sanitation ministry to be able to understand where some of the real gaps were. And that's when we realized, actually, when it comes to sanitation, we only have 2 indicators on sanitation, which is insufficient to really be able to understand, for instance, the urban dimension and the urban challenges of sanitation and so forth. So I don't want to dominate the discussion, but it was just to say that there's a real value to the work that CDG's been doing at the local level in engaging with citizens, but how those citizens are then represented by broader national civil society players that can apply a more sustained pressure on the state, and how that evidence gets used in policymaking was part of our next step in a really fascinating project that Dede and I and Clear AA collaborated with Twende Mbele on to try to get political buy-in for the need to widen the administrative data systems. And if Henrietta was able to come online, she has certainly been one of the champions in taking this important work forward. Thank you.
I think yeah, just to add to what Leila just said, I think that one of the decisions we made in the first district league table in 2014 was to go with the uncompleted data on the administrative, on the sanitation sector. And we made a blunt decision, so let's publish what we have and see what happens. And certainly when we published that, I think the previous year's census was conducted to begin to streamline the data collection processes in the sanitation sector. So I think that there's value in spotlighting on some of these administrative challenges with these kinds of interventions and initiatives that would then bring a national conversation around how to improve the data generation ecosystem in the state.
Yeah, thank you both. And I think there are a number of questions related to that very same point about administrative data. Awal, you mentioned the challenges with coordination, especially between government and civil society, and that you were using administrative data. Oftentimes, I think we know that in governments, that data is on somebody's computer or it's in paper format, and like you had to go to many departments, many units within government to access this data. So there are a number of questions around how did you go about, one, improving coordination, and then two, accessing that data as essentially an outsider. You're not government. CDD-Ghana is a civil society organization. And what lessons can be applied to other contexts as well?
So one, to sort of deal with the coordination problem, we sort of set up a working group with each of the sectors that were interested in collecting the data, with the key persons working in the sector. And so every year we would have this data methodological workshop where we bring them in and have a conversation about what we need, what the challenges are, and what even we can advocate on their behalf to be able to improve resource allocation further. So one for me that worked for us is the methodological workshop that we have each year, every year with this data producing sectors, and to be able to do that. The other thing that was very helpful for us, again, in terms of accessibility, was the informal relationship that we built with the desk officers themselves. And so Tony is a friend. I can pick a phone call and call him, say, oh, wow, the data is ready, it's not ready, I'm cleaning it up. Or I can get it. Sometimes, even before it's validated, I can give you a picture that you can look at so that you start processing your data before I can give you the final data. So informal relationships are key, as I talked about in my presentation. You ought to build this kinds of relationship with the people who actually are producing this data so that we can be able to have access to it. There are also attempts that we've done, particularly, for example, for the security data, which may not be sanitation, where we physically build capacity in terms of how the data is collected, analyzed, processed, and curated at the department. And so we organize a workshop for them, a capacity building workshop for them, improve their templating for collecting this data, bringing all of their data officers across all of the regions to come and be trained more, so that when they go back, they can be able to collect the data that is useful for our kind of work. So for some of the specific sectors where we find challenges in relation to how the data is collected, we try to invest. And that's what I talked about. Evidence use requires time and investment. We ought to invest in the capacity to generate that data for which we can use to sort of synthesize and produce the evidence that we think can inform policy.
Yes, I think I wanted to talk about two things I see here. One is the role of VOPs, and then the other was how to integrate research in the general stuff that CSOs do. You know, most of us are so busy with service provision, service delivery, and so on. So bringing in research seems a little bit far-fetched for a lot of CSOs. But what I found is if you can integrate research into the program, if it stands alone, then you're looking for research grants and so on, you move into another area of work, which doesn't always work. But if you do a lot of advocacy, then you can integrate research as a key component of that. And it makes sense because based upon your research, you can make a good case for your advocacy. You can also link it in through your M&E, that your M&E is not just the routine data you're picking every day, but you actually go out there to do a couple of surveys, do real focused research on the issues you want to take up, so that the research aspect of your work as a CSO doesn't stand alone, but is integrated. I think it makes it a little easier to raise funding for that kind of work. Now, the role of VOPs when it comes to this, I don't know about how all other VOPs work, but for us in Ghana, we decided that our role would be more of a catalyst role. We would not take over what our members can do, but we will assist and we will broker relationships. So it's from that perspective that we looked at this work, that this was something where we could bring together key actors in our development space. So government is so key, and yet there are so many ways in which government falls short and CSOs step in, and yet they cannot talk together on the core thing they all use, which is evidence. So we thought that this was a good way to bring the two parties together. And I think it's worked actually very well. I'd like to encourage other VOPs to look at areas like this, that they could also push at a national level. And again, the advantage we have is because we are a national institution, we have both members from the public and the private sector. So we have government members who are happy to take some of this on from the point of view of a GMEF project or a GMEF relationship as against their own official capacity. And I think that has really worked well for us. Thank you.
Thank you both. One of the questions that came up was around, and I think how you mentioned that there was actually Dede and Awal, you both mentioned that there was political will. The president created this new ministry, the statistics were bad, and yeah, he wanted to change that. But you also mentioned that I think we know that political will at the top doesn't always translate to political will at the other levels where stuff needs to get done. Can you speak a little bit about that as well? That were the signals consistent from the top to the district to where actually the sanitation services are delivered? Did you find that to be consistent? And what, if not, what were some of the challenges?
Was not much with resources, so put your resources where your mouth is. And certainly, whilst the president at the top sort of was interested in changing the statistics, the story around opinification, all of these indicators in the sector, the question about how much allocated over time to allow low. That is one big thing. And so you will not find willingness, even though there may be awareness of the issue, but the question about whether we have the resources to be able to deal with this issue or enough resources that are allocated to us to deal with it is a big, big issue. There is also the whole governance structure that affects that. So if you look at our decentralization policy framework, the center still controls law. Contracting is done at the center. So sanitation by craft from the central government, where a contractor is contracted and is given marching orders to go to the local areas and be able to attend to some sanitation problem. The question about accountability, the question about real responsiveness to the needs and issues that affect citizens at that level, also are things that we found that has come up for us. And we've raised some of the issues about how then do you improve the institutional architecture of center government relationship that can for local policy makers, the capacity and even when to, as an express commitment of your willingness to see a better outcome for the sanitation sector.
Great, thank you. One of the issues with administrative data, and I think in this case, there's also that risk that, well, districts want to look good. So you're depending on government collected administrative data. Everybody wants to be at the top because it's embarrassing being at the bottom. There was a question around data quality. How were you able to verify that, one, this data is accurate, but that were you also able to check that that data was of good quality?
Yeah. So we did have a problem. It sort of came up. The district will tell you, come to us and come and collect the data. And so we use the mother ministries at the center to collect the data, understanding that there is a process within that sector for data, how data is collected and how it is validated and then published as a national data set. So from that premise, we focus on the center to collect the data. Now, when we publish these results, in particular, when we go to the local level, they say, no, we don't believe that this is actually our data. And so it even creates understanding for us about the center-local relationship in terms of how the data is generated, the circle back to the local actors. Say, this is actually the certified data at that level. That was one big problem that has come for us. And to eliminate data padding, we said, look, we will not come to your district where you then say you want to look good, and so you give us a data that we don't know how data on your key national mother who certified this late MP on specific was something that we were not willing to do. And that for us ensured the quality of the data in terms of rely on the national framework standardization for certifying and standardizing this data and publishing it as a national data set for use. And there were two sectors where we found the system to be very, very rigorous. If you look at education, they had the education information management system, which was quite very robust. If you look at the health sector, you find the district health information management system, which was also quite robust. Outside of these two sectors, the rest are just haphazard. The systems are not that quite very strong. And so you have to deal with what you have, and hopefully by publicizing it, you raise some of these data gaps, which can then commit or some kind of conversation about how do we do to improve the quality of data in some of these sectors where we have some of these gaps. But for sanitation, that is what has happened over the.
Great, thank you very much, Awal. Dede, you wanted to add?
Yes, I was just going to say that I'm trying to get Henrietta on the phone. One, she wants to respond to some of the questions.
Hello, is it working now?
Great. Yes,
okay,
it
that's
is.
why I cut the call. I realized the unmute button popped up. Sorry.
Over to
Yes,
you then.
please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry for the technical challenge. My name is Henrietta Osei-Tutu, and then I'm a program manager at the Ministry of Sanitation, Water and Resources. I'll say that this project is really an interesting one for us because as government, we are always used to working and taking our decisions and always thinking that CSOs are also doing their own thing. But this actually is a good partnership, or more like a win-win partnership for both governments and also CSOs, for us to also understand and view their concerns with their in their own eyes, and then to be able to judge and find solutions, concrete solutions to some of the issues that will be raised from the citizens' end. But I had something to say at the beginning, but because I'm coming in a bit in the middle, I just want to respond to what the question that Awal was trying to answer about the data, the robustness of the data from health and then education and vis-a-vis sanitation. And so maybe it's also interesting that CSOs also understand a bit how the different structures in these sectors work. Once that understanding is made, or once that understanding is established, you see the difference, or you'll be able to account why MS and then the health data is very robust and rigorous, because these two departments are what we would call the deconcentrated department. They are not necessarily decentralized currently in our local government administrative framework. And even for sanitation, if you go to the district assemblies, we still don't have our fully fledged departments in place. And so it makes the generation of this data on a regular basis very, very, very difficult, apart from relying on census and then some specialized surveys like the GLSS and then the demographic and health survey. We really do not really have any consistent, or I would say, a consistent way of reporting on our progress that we have made in the sanitation. And these are some of the things that we are currently working on to upskill. And so once we work with the CSOs also, they would also begin to appreciate some of the issues that are on the ground, and then we'll be able to find an amicable solution, or we'll be able to contribute both ways to achieve the objective of the initiative. So that's what I would want to say for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Henrietta. And I think that actually raises another question that's also been raised here, which is in a sector where you have the majority of the activities by civil society organizations, and government is doing its part, but a lot of the work is also being done by CSOs who are funded by donors who have their own reporting requirements and data and evidence requirements. And that those projects are not long-term, they're not forever. It'll be like 2 years or 5 years because it's USAID funded. How do you then build this ecosystem where you're trying to be inclusive, and so you're building the data systems, but with a part of the ecosystem that's not going to be there long-term, because the funding for water aid might end and they'll stop operating in that particular area. The project might come to a close. What are some thoughts on how you can build inclusive data systems where the majority of the action is actually being done by these types of initiatives that are not long-term?
Yes, so yeah, that's very true. I would say that for now, we have one of our systems called the Basic Sanitation Information Management System, which is actually it's generated at the district assembly level, and it's accessible at the district, the region, and then the national level. And what we are trying to do currently now is to rope in all the CSOs and the NGOs that are working within that particular district in the area of, this is specifically for basic sanitation, this system is for sanitation. And so to be able to get them to report on their activities using this basis, we call it basis. And so these are one of the initiatives that we are doing. We are rolling out to actually be able to gain access to the progress that is being made or the interventions that are being made by various CSOs and NGOs or CBOs, and also to be able to monitor and see how we are sustaining the gains on these various activities. So this is just one of the initiatives that we are embarking upon. But as you rightly mentioned, a lot of the activities are being done by the CSOs because of the limited attention that was given to sanitation. And currently we are seeing a lot of support, political support, and also we are enjoying some level of attention to actually address some of these root problems or the root causes. Basically, for us, they are institutional problems, because if you look at sanitation at the district level, we just have a sanitation unit that is even under the Department of Health. We don't even have a waste management department at the district assembly level. So some of these issues are really, really institutional and structural issues that need to be tackled head on. And so now in the Ministry of Sanitation, we are actually tackling some of these root causes to be able to build those sustainable systems or sustainable structures to actually own, report, monitor activities of various agencies or organizations that are working on sanitation within a particular area. So once some of these structural issues are fixed, we believe that we'll be able to, just be able to be on top of all the issues that are related to sanitation in the country. Yes.
Thank you very much, Henrietta. There was a question around closing the feedback loop. So citizens provide the feedback about the quality of services. Like what mechanisms did you put in place to ensure that they then knew that the evidence, the information they provided was acted upon? Maybe we can hear from Dede or Awal.
So that's where our other complementary project we call the I'm Aware comes into play. And so once we provided this forum, Citizen Government Interface Forum, where these conversations happen, some action points and social actions are designed, where there's a feedback and reporting system annually, quarterly, where we mobilize citizens and bring in these government actors to come and respond or to provide feedback on what was done, to maybe 3 months ago, we had a meeting and we discussed, you agreed, you made this commitment. We are following up on this commitment. Come explain to us how you acted on this commitment and so on and so forth. So on a very small scale, around 20 districts, that's what we use then the I Am Aware initiative to do, where then we create these citizen groups. We have this regular interface where government actors can come and explain and respond to some issues that citizens may have raised or we may have found from the evidence that we generate.
Yes, and I think there was an evaluation of, is it the I'm Aware project that tells us a little bit of how this has actually worked. So maybe later on we can share the link so that people
that evaluation,
yes, what in real practical terms has come out of the project. But as he said, it's still small. There's still so much more to be done. But I do think that it's a good start and people can learn from
it. Great. Thank you very much. I think another question that I had missed earlier was around the types of evidence that you generated within the, I think the I Am Aware project. I think somebody asked Awal if you could just go through very briefly, there's 2 types of evidence that were generated from that project.
Yeah, so essentially what we did was to focus on 6 sectors: education, health, water, sanitation, roads, agriculture. And for each one of them, we certainly will look at some input output indicators that we then analyze and then rank all the districts on. So that's essentially what we do. And this indicated are nationally agreed indicators. So that's what we used. Essentially, we don't generate the indicators by ourselves. So for instance, if it is education, we are interested in people to teacher ratio, right? We want to be core textbook to people ratio. We are also interested, if it's in the health, we are interested in maternal mortality, for instance. We are interested in the number of skilled birth attendants that we have in our district. So all of these indicators are sector-specific indicators that are agreed to, which we then use to analyze and then see across the geographical space what the performance looks like and what needs to be done to improve that, and what may be the causal factors for why we have poor performance in some areas and better performance in other areas.
Great, thank you. And I think one other question that's related to what you just said, Awal, is with regards to reaching out to citizens to gather feedback, but then also share progress. How inclusive were the channels? So I think there's a question on what other alternative channels were available, since not everybody has a smartphone, for instance, or access to the internet or access to the radio, to make sure that these channels are as inclusive as possible.
So one other thing we do, particularly in the rural areas, is the physical meetings, right? The physical town hall meetings where we mobilize citizens and facilitate their attendance, because there's transactional cost to citizens' participation, right? And so we try in our own small way to facilitate that and to take away that transactional cost and to bring them to a meeting where they can regularly have these kinds of feedback. They don't have access to internet, as you rightly said. Radio may be a problem, even though it's widespread, but also those physical meetings where they have one-on-one meetings or group meetings, either they are a group, social group, maybe market women, then we facilitate their engagement on some sanitation issue with the sanitation department officer to ask questions and to get feedback. If it's on education, the parent-teacher association, the school management board, we try to bring them together in the physical meeting where they have this town hall style kind of convenience where they can get those kinds of feedback and to ask those kinds of questions that needed to be addressed from the evidence that we generate or from their own monitoring evidence that they have.
Thank you. I'd love to bring in Mine back and to speak about one of the pieces of feedback that you got, that you mentioned, Awal, which was people asking, what's in it for me? Sort of asking for the incentive, what incentives do I have to act on this evidence? Mine, how can we incentivize evidence use more broadly in governments, both at the national level, but also at the subnational level?
Thanks, Chris. I mean, I think one really good way of incentivizing evidence use is to use it and close that feedback loop. From the case, if I think about the case in Kenya, some of the incentives in this case the decision makers were directly involved in the evidence journey. So this was a case of a parliamentary committee where they themselves were part and parcel of the evidence journey. And in doing so, I think there was significant incentives for them to then engage with and apply the evidence as it was coming through. So to me, that would be one very, very important part of it, is really to involve the policymakers and not sort of at all stages, from generation through to use. And very often when we involve the decision makers at the end of the evidence journey. So we generate the evidence, we go through the processes, and then we say, but look, you know, all of this has happened, please use it, why don't you believe us, sort of thing. And that's a much, much harder path to take.
Just to add to what Mine said, so in the context of where you have regional governments, so this is maybe a sector parliamentary group, but where you have sectors, government in 260 districts in Ghana, you cannot bring all of them in the curating process or the co-production process of the evidence. And so one of the other things that we found out that was useful, which we were working with, was to see that if you look at the evidence to policy practice ecosystem, is there a reward system to say, for example, the management system for local government, the performance contract? Is there a way where people are rewarded for being innovative in the way they bring in evidence to inform the decision-making process that they have? That was one of the incentives we were fighting to get the Office of the Head of Local Government Service to try, as part of their performance contracting and management processes, to bring in the question about how you become innovative in the way you bring in evidence in terms of your decision-making process. We thought that could be one other incentive to incentivize particularly low-level policy actors who are looking for promotion, for example. On what basis am I promoted? Would this promote me? Would I get a promotion by using your evidence and I'll be rewarded for it? If we do get a situation where these kinds of evidence or the system for reward for policy actors at the local level also recognizes these kinds of innovations and use, that can also be helpful.
Great, thank you. I want to check if Henrietta wants to speak, because she has a hand up, or if it's from the last time. Henrietta, please.
Hello?
Yes, did you want to say something? All right, probably not. Final question, and I'm looking at the time now. So I think that the DLT is sort of, it was risky, I would say, in that it's basically naming and shaming poor performers. At the same time, you want their cooperation to give you data that feeds into the DLT. How did you balance that? And what was in particular, the experience working with those districts and authorities that were ranked, especially after the first year, at the very bottom? Like, were you able to continue to work with them in subsequent years? How was that experience?
So
we often find that it's a very difficult balance in our own work. You want to be a partner to the government. You don't want to name and shame individuals for failing to perform their duties.
So let me address, I was laughing because there were quite experiences we had in the first year, even with the Ministry for Local Government. Even the name district league table, they wanted us to change because it connotes naming, shaming, performance, low. So they wanted a different name. And when we insisted that, yes, we are deliberate with the name so that it can sort of evoke some kind of emotion and to get people's attention. On the day of the launch, the ministry said, I'm out of it. Don't count me in. They send us a letter and say, we don't want to participate again. But subsequently, we sort of, this informal relationship that I talked about, explain and say, look, this is really to create that kind of emotion, to bring in that kind of emotion, particularly for citizens that can incentivize some kind of action, particularly at the local level. With the local level bureaucrat, the first year I got beaten up when I went to a district to present the report. They beat me up and said I'd named and shamed them. And the media, the way the media carried the story, they say, oh, you've won last, they are last, they failed, they cannot do anything. We've seen parliamentarians who were losing elections and blaming it on the DLT. We've seen DCs, district mayors, who have been beaten up and blaming it on me for publicizing this report and threatening me with a court case. But subsequently, when you go back and you have these dialogue sessions with them and explain the rationale and the methodology, you then get a lot of the buy-in. As Mine said, the process of creating and co-creating this evidence with them, again, then they get the buy-in and they are able to accept this. So year on year, you begin to see the acceptance level has improved. They now see the value and they are now able to go out there and explain. And additionally, what we did was that we normally would give these government actors the right to see the first report, right, to see the first findings and to prepare for some responses and to share that with them. So that at least you are not ambushing them, really. You are not trying to ambush them, but being very open to say, look, this is what we found out from the evidence. Do you have any thoughts about it? Do you have any response to it? Prepare your mind so that when we go out into the market of citizens, when they come at you, you can be able to explain so that you are not caught off guard. Those were little steps that we took to ensure that there is some kind of acceptability of both the process and the product that we produce.
Excellent. Thank you so very much. On that note, I'd love to ask for concluding thoughts from all of the panelists. And I'll start with you, Awal, and then we'll move to Dede and Mine.
Yes, so for me, there's value in civil society participation in the creation of evidence, but also understanding that government has a very important role to play, and involving government from the start is very important. In the absence of that, you certainly would face a lot of challenges. You are not creating evidence only for yourself, you're also creating for it to inform some kind of decision. But I think we'll get into a lot of trouble.
Great. Just to add that, I think this is for all of us. And so from our perspective, when we come into this as a VOPI or as people who are into evaluation, our interest is to get all stakeholders on board and see how we can promote the use of real evidence, tested and accepted evidence. And so increasingly, we will try to bring more stakeholders on board, and that includes the citizen. At the end of the day, really, development for the country is for the people. Thank you.
Thank you, Dede. Mine?
Yeah, I think for me, the thing I'd like to highlight is something we say at each one of these, is the significance of recognizing how proactive one has to be to ensure evidence use, and also not underestimating the importance of investing in trust building and relationship building to enable that. Thanks, Chris. Thank you.
Absolutely, and that's really the approach. In our own experience, as I do inside, building trust is important. I think we moved from previously having one-off projects where you come in and generate evidence and leave, to now sticking around because you want to be seen as part of the furniture within the government entity. You want to be invited to those meetings that they have, internal meetings, so that you can appreciate what the challenges that they face, what their context is, so that you can generate, as you're generating evidence, you use that to inform the process of generating the evidence to increase the likelihood of that evidence being used, being accepted. So it's been such a great panel. Thank you so very much to our panelists, and thanks to Clear Anglophone Africa for organizing this. I think Ian shared the link to the book. There's actually a free version of the book, an open access version of the book, which is available as a PDF. You can download that and read this particular case study, chapter 11 yourself. But thank you so very much, everybody, for joining, and I wish you a good rest of your day.
Thank you too. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.